In the early hours of a cold February morning, the unthinkable became reality. Russian hypersonic missiles slammed into Polish territory with devastating precision, killing 17 NATO personnel and obliterating a critical logistics hub just 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This was not a stray munition. This was not an accident. This was a calculated strike that has triggered Article 5 of the NATO treaty for the first time in the alliance's 75-year history. And what happened next exposes everything wrong with Western leadership in this new era of modern warfare. While Moscow calmly announced the strike as a legitimate military operation targeting what they called a NATO weapons transfer facility, Washington descended into chaos. President Biden's response, delayed by 72 hours of emergency meetings, frantic calls to European capitals, and internal disagreements that revealed the cracks in the so-called strongest military alliance in history. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed his nation with the composure of a chess master who just executed a move planned months in advance, explaining exactly why Russia felt compelled to strike and what consequences await if NATO escalates further. The mainstream media wants you to believe this is Russian aggression spiraling out of control. They want you to see Putin as a desperate dictator making reckless moves. But stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal shows something completely different. This strike represents a carefully calculated demonstration of capabilities that NATO has no answer for, executed at a moment of maximum Western vulnerability, and designed to expose the emperor has no clothes when it comes to defending Eastern Europe against hypersonic weapons traveling at 10 times the speed of sound. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is developing by the hour and you need to stay ahead of the sanitized version the establishment media is feeding you. The truth about modern warfare, about hypersonic technology, and about the strategic chess game unfolding in Eastern Europe is not going to come from CNN or the Pentagon briefing room. It's going to come from independent analysis that connects the dots they desperately want to keep separated. Now let's dive into what really happened and why it changes everything. The weapons that struck Poland were not ordinary missiles. Russian forces deployed Kinzhal hypersonic missiles launched from MiG-31K interceptors operating from Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania. The Kinzhal, which translates to dagger in English, travels at Mach 10, that's 7,670 miles per hour, following an unpredictable trajectory that makes interception virtually impossible with current NATO air defense systems. Each missile costs approximately $10 million, a fraction of the defensive systems meant to stop them, and carries a conventional warhead capable of penetrating hardened structures deep underground. The target was a logistics coordination center in Rzeszów, Poland, a facility that has served as the primary hub for Western weapons flowing into Ukraine for the past 3 years. This was not some random warehouse. Intelligence reports indicate the facility coordinated the transfer of HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot missile batteries, and advanced Western armor, including British Challenger tanks and German Leopards. Russian military intelligence had been tracking this location for months, building detailed targeting data, while NATO commanders assumed their logistics networks behind Polish borders were untouchable, protected by the sacred Article 5 guarantee that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. That assumption shattered at 03:45 local time when 3 Kinzhal missiles struck within a span of 90 seconds. The first missile penetrated 6 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating, collapsing the main coordination center and killing 12 American logistics personnel, 3 Polish liaison officers, and 2 British military advisors. The second missile destroyed an adjacent ammunition storage facility, triggering secondary explosions that continued for 40 minutes and sent a fireball visible from 30 kilometers away. The third missile struck a vehicle depot blow, obliterating 50 transport trucks and creating a crater 20 meters wide and 8 meters deep. Polish air defense systems never had a chance. The country's primary protection consists of Patriot batteries positioned around Warsaw and other strategic locations, but Patriots were designed to intercept aircraft and traditional ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories. Hypersonic weapons like the Kinjal maneuver during their terminal phase, making last-second course corrections that render traditional interception calculations useless. By the time Polish radar operators confirmed incoming threats, the missiles had already struck their targets. The total time from launch detection to impact was estimated at 4 minutes and 20 seconds, not nearly enough time to scramble interceptors, alert personnel, or initiate meaningful defensive measures. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Major General Igor Konashenkov addressed the strike in a press conference broadcast across state media just 6 hours after the attack. Standing before a detailed map showing the Rzeszów facility and documented weapons transfers, Konashenkov explained that Russia had repeatedly warned NATO against transforming Poland into a forward logistics base for weapons used to strike Russian territory. He presented satellite imagery showing the facility's expansion over the past 18 months, with new warehouses, increased security perimeters, and constant flow of heavy transport vehicles. According to Konashenkov, Russian intelligence had tracked over $40 billion worth of Western military equipment flowing through this single location, equipment directly responsible for strikes on Russian forces and civilian infrastructure in occupied Ukrainian territories. The general's tone remained measured, almost professorial, as he explained Russia's legal justification. According to Moscow's interpretation, NATO's direct involvement in facilitating weapons transfers used to strike Russian forces makes these logistics hubs legitimate military targets regardless of their geographic location. He cited precedents from previous conflicts where belligerent nations struck supply lines in neutral or allied territories when those facilities directly supported combat operations. The message was clear. Russia views this not as an escalation, but as a logical extension of existing military operations. And NATO's Article 5 shield does not protect facilities actively engaged in prosecuting warfare against Russian forces. Now, here's where this gets truly revealing about the current state of Western leadership and alliance cohesion. President Biden's initial response came not at 6 hours, not at 12 hours, but 72 hours after the strike. And when it finally arrived, it was a masterclass in hesitation, masquerading as measured response. The president, reading from carefully prepared remarks, condemned the attack as unacceptable, promised full support for Poland, and announced the deployment of an additional 5,000 American troops to Polish territory, along with 2 Patriot batteries and enhanced air surveillance assets. But what Biden did not announce speaks far louder than what he did. No immediate military retaliation, no strikes on Russian territory, no mobilization of NATO's rapid response force for offensive operations. Instead, emergency consultations, intelligence sharing, diplomatic channels, and strong language. The response package, while significant on paper, amounts to defensive reinforcement of the exact type that failed to prevent the initial strike. More Patriots that cannot intercept hypersonic missiles, more troops in defensive positions, more rhetoric about unity and resolve, while the fundamental question remains unanswered. What exactly will NATO do if Russia strikes again? Behind closed doors, the 72-hour delay revealed something even more troubling for the alliance. According to leaked diplomatic cables reported by multiple European sources, emergency NATO consultations devolved into chaotic disagreements about response options, legal interpretations of Article 5 obligations, and fundamental questions about escalation risks. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly argued for diplomatic engagement before military response, emphasizing the catastrophic consequences of direct NATO-Russia military confrontation. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz echoed these concerns, noting that German public opinion polls show 73% opposition to German military involvement in direct conflict with Russia over Ukraine-related issues. Poland and the Baltic states, predictably, demanded immediate and overwhelming military response, including strikes on Russian territory, closure of the Kaliningrad exclave, and full implementation of NATO warfighting protocols. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, speaking to Parliament with barely controlled fury, declared that Polish blood had been spilled by Russian aggression and that NATO's credibility as a defensive alliance now hung in the balance. If Article 5 means anything, Tusk argued, it must mean automatic, devastating retaliation that makes such attacks unthinkable in the future. The fact that this retaliation did not materialize, he suggested, sends a signal to Moscow that NATO's most sacred commitment is more conditional than absolute. The United Kingdom occupied a middle position, supporting strong defensive measures while avoiding calls for direct strikes on Russian territory. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer emphasized the need for measured response that strengthens NATO's defensive posture without triggering the wider European war that Putin allegedly desires. This position satisfied no one, appearing too aggressive for Western European nations seeking de-escalation and too timid for Eastern European allies demanding retribution. What emerged from these 72 hours of consultations was not NATO unity, but rather a painfully exposed alliance suffering from strategic paralysis, divergent threat perceptions, and fundamental disagreements about acceptable risk in the nuclear age. The deployment package ultimately announced represented the maximum consensus response, not an optimal strategic answer to Russian aggression. It was the lowest common denominator that all members could reluctantly accept, which is exactly what Moscow was counting on. Because here's what Russia's strike actually accomplished beyond the immediate military damage. It demonstrated that NATO has no effective defense against hypersonic weapons, proving the alliance's protective umbrella has gaping holes that cannot be quickly filled. It exposed the 72-hour delay and internal disagreements, showing adversaries that NATO's decision-making process is ponderous and divided when rapid response is required. It established precedent that logistics facilities supporting Ukraine operations can be targeted even in NATO territory, fundamentally changing the risk calculus for alliance members hosting these operations. It tested Article 5 commitment and found it wanting, revealing that the supposedly automatic collective defense provision is actually subject to extensive consultation, debate, and conditional interpretation. Most significantly, it shifted the escalation initiative to Moscow, forcing NATO into reactive defensive posture, while Russia retains the option to strike again, expand targeting to other logistics hubs in Romania or Germany, or de-escalate temporarily while consolidating gains. This is not the action of a desperate regime making reckless gambles. This is calculated strategy exploiting technological superiority, psychological understanding of Western decision-making processes, and precise timing to maximum advantage. Let's talk about the technology gap, because this is where American exceptionalism confronts uncomfortable reality. The United States military, despite spending over $800 billion annually, has no deployed hypersonic weapon system comparable to Russia's Kinzhal, Zircon, or Avangard platforms. American hypersonic development programs have suffered repeated test failures, budget overruns, and deployment delays, while Russian systems have been operational for years, proven in combat conditions, and continuously improved through iterative development. The Kinzhal specifically represents a technological leap that NATO has struggled to counter. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles following predictable parabolic trajectories or cruise missiles flying at subsonic speeds vulnerable to interception, hypersonic weapons combine ballistic missile speed with cruise missile maneuverability. They fly too fast for most radar systems to track effectively, maneuver unpredictably during terminal approach, making interception calculations impossible, and impact with such kinetic energy that even without explosive warheads, they devastate targets through sheer velocity. The physics of interception at these speeds and with this maneuverability remain largely unsolved problems for Western air defense systems designed in an earlier technological era. Russia developed these capabilities not through massive military budgets, but through focused investment in specific technological areas where asymmetric advantage could be achieved. While America spent trillions on global power projection, regime change operations, and counterinsurgency campaigns, Russia invested heavily in missile technology, air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and Arctic operations. The result is a military that cannot match American global reach, but possesses overmatched capabilities in specific domains critical to defending Russian interests in its near abroad. The cost comparison is equally stark and reinforces the recurring theme in modern warfare: expensive Western systems defeated by cheaper, more focused alternatives. The Rzeszów Logistics Center represented perhaps $800 million in infrastructure investment, personnel, equipment, and operational capability. Russia destroyed it with 3 Kinzhal missiles costing a combined $30 million, a return on investment of over 25 to 1 when measuring destruction achieved per dollar spent. The Patriots now deploying to Poland cost approximately $4 million per interceptor missile and have demonstrated zero effectiveness against hypersonic targets in combat conditions. Defending against another Russian strike will require either non-existent hypersonic interceptors or saturation deployment of traditional systems, hoping to achieve lucky hits through volume of fire. Meanwhile, Russian military doctrine has evolved to explicitly incorporate these asymmetric advantages into operational planning. The strike on Rzeszów was not improvised or opportunistic, but rather the execution of pre-planned contingencies developed months in advance, war-gamed extensively, and held in reserve for the optimal moment. Russian strategists understand that their conventional military cannot match NATO in protracted conventional warfare, but they do not need to match NATO across all domains. They only need overmatch in specific capabilities at critical moments to achieve strategic objectives, while NATO's decision-making paralysis prevents effective response. This doctrine of calibrated escalation has proven remarkably effective throughout the Ukraine conflict. Russia escalates to a specific level, observes Western response, consolidates gains, and then chooses whether to escalate further or pause based on cost-benefit analysis. Each escalation tests Western resolve, exposes alliance fissures, and normalizes previously unthinkable actions. Strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure were once considered escalatory and unacceptable. Now they're routine. Mobilization of 300,000 additional Russian troops was supposed to trigger massive Western response. Instead, it prompted more sanctions that Russia has largely adapted to. The destruction of Kakhovka Dam was predicted to cause international outcry. The outcry lasted 72 hours before media moved on. The Rzeszów strike represents another step in this calibrated escalation ladder, this time crossing the threshold into NATO territory with precision that minimizes civilian casualties while maximizing psychological impact. Russian planners specifically targeted military logistics personnel rather than civilian infrastructure, providing Moscow with legal defensibility while still triggering Article 5 obligations. The strike was large enough to be undeniable and significant, but limited enough to provide NATO with off-ramps for de-escalation if the alliance chooses to accept the new reality rather than risk wider war. And here's the truly troubling question that NATO leadership desperately wants to avoid. What happens when Russia does this again? Because nothing in the Western response suggests that Moscow will face consequences sufficient to deter future strikes. The defensive reinforcements address symptoms, not causes. More troops in Poland do not make logistics hubs less vulnerable to hypersonic attack. More Patriot batteries do not solve the interception problem. More diplomatic consultations do not accelerate NATO decision-making or resolve fundamental disagreements about escalation risks. Russian military bloggers and state media commentators have been explicit about the implications. If NATO continues using Polish territory as a logistics hub for weapons striking Russian forces, Russia retains the right to strike those facilities regardless of their location. If additional NATO countries host similar operations, they become equally valid targets. The message is clear. NATO territory is not sanctuary if that territory is actively supporting military operations against Russia. This interpretation fundamentally undermines the foundational assumption of NATO's Eastern European members that alliance membership provides absolute security regardless of their actions in regional conflicts. What we're witnessing is the collision of Cold War alliance structures with 21st century technological realities and strategic calculations. NATO was designed to deter Soviet conventional invasion of Western Europe, with Article 5 serving as tripwire, making any attack on alliance territory automatically trigger overwhelming American military response. That deterrent framework assumed clear red lines, conventional warfare domains, and decision-making timeframes measured in days or weeks. None of those assumptions hold in an era of hypersonic weapons, hybrid warfare, and distributed logistics networks spanning multiple countries. Russia has identified and exploited the gap between NATO's rhetorical commitments and practical capabilities. The alliance promises collective defense but delivers diplomatic consultations, defensive measures, and escalation hesitancy. This gap will only widen as technological advantages in hypersonic weapons, electronic warfare, and cyber capabilities allow Russia to impose costs on NATO operations while remaining below the threshold that would trigger unified military response. Moscow is essentially calling NATO's bluff, betting that the alliance will not risk nuclear war over logistics hubs, that European publics will not support direct combat involvement, and that American security guarantees are more conditional than advertised. The broader implications extend far beyond Poland or even Europe. Every American ally watching this crisis is drawing conclusions about the reliability of security commitments, the willingness to defend partners when costs become significant, and the credibility of red lines drawn by Washington. If NATO will not effectively defend Polish territory after 17 alliance personnel were killed in a deliberate strike, why would Taiwan believe American commitment to defend against Chinese invasion? Why would South Korea trust security guarantees when North Korea resumes provocations? Why would Gulf Arab states align with Washington rather than hedging with Beijing and Moscow? President Biden's 72-hour delay in responding will be studied in war colleges and strategic planning centers for decades as a case study in alliance management failure and strategic communication breakdown. Those 72 hours told adversaries everything they needed to know about Western decision-making speed, alliance cohesion, and willingness to accept costs in defending stated interests. Putin's 6-hour response told a different story. Russia acts decisively, explains its actions clearly, and sets terms for future engagement without apology or hesitation. The question now is whether NATO can adapt to this new strategic environment or whether the alliance will continue operating on outdated assumptions until the next crisis reveals further gaps between commitments and capabilities. The deployment of additional forces to Poland addresses the immediate political need to demonstrate solidarity, but does nothing to solve the fundamental problems exposed by the Rzeszów strike. NATO still has no effective defense against hypersonic weapons. The alliance still takes days to make decisions that Russia makes in hours. Member states still disagree fundamentally about acceptable risk and appropriate response to Russian aggression. None of these problems have solutions that can be implemented quickly or without painful political and strategic adjustments. What happens next depends on choices being made right now in Moscow, Washington, Warsaw, and other capitals. Russia can choose to pocket its gains, observe NATO's response, and strike again when strategically advantageous. NATO can choose to accept the new reality and adjust its operations accordingly, or it can double down on supporting Ukraine through Polish logistics hubs while hoping Russian restraint continues. Poland can choose to demand more from its allies, or it can recognize that geography and great power politics limit what even the world's strongest alliance can deliver. The United States can choose to prioritize European security, or it can continue dividing attention between multiple theaters while adversaries exploit overstretched tension. None of these choices are easy and all involve significant costs and risks. But what's absolutely certain is that the old assumptions no longer hold. The comfortable certainties of the post-Cold War era have vanished, and we are now in an era of great power competition where technological advantage, strategic calculation, and willingness to accept costs matter more than alliance structures designed for a different age. The hypersonic strike on Poland is not an isolated incident. It's a preview of how modern warfare will be conducted when adversaries possess both technological superiority in specific domains and leadership willing to use that superiority to achieve strategic objectives. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that like button and share this video with others who need to understand what's really happening beyond the mainstream narrative. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on NATO's response and whether the alliance can adapt to this new strategic environment. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this situation is evolving rapidly and you need analysis that connects the dots others miss. The truth about modern warfare, great power competition, and the future of European security is not going to come from sanitized Pentagon briefings or establishment media cheerleading. It's going to come from independent voices willing to analyze events objectively and draw uncomfortable conclusions that powerful interests would prefer remain unspoken. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. So, di ditro wachi we.